Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Numisa Makadla from South North in Cape Town. I would like to welcome all members to the African Mini-Grids Community of Practice AMG-CoP Interactive Session. The session is titled Productive Use of Energy Mini-Grids, Primer and Key Issues. Tim will be your host and moderator, and I will be your co-host to this meeting. On to general housekeeping for this session. All presenters will be presenting a series of enlightening presentations. I'll be keeping time on them. We'll only be exchanging questions and answers after all presentations have been made. You may use your raise your hand function if you have questions. You're also asked to submit your questions via the Q&A button, which should be at the bottom of your Zoom webinar interface. Please note that the presenter to whom you would like to address the question to. As the co-host, I'll screen the questions and relay them verbally to the panelists. We aim to answer as many questions as possible in the allotted time, and any questions we can't answer live, we'll ask the presenter to answer in writing following the event. This meeting is being recorded and we will share it with you following the event. So please consider sharing it to anyone you may know that would have loved to view it but couldn't attend today. I will now hand over to Tim to do the introduction.
Great. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Fantastic. Okay, showing my screen. So thanks all for joining us. To see a couple friendly and familiar names. So glad you guys are able to join us, and I think we might have a few more joining us as things go on, but we don't want to get started too late here, so I think we'll just go ahead and get started. So yeah, so today's session is on productive use of energy in mini-grids. It's key issues and considerations, so it's sort of a primer on productive use. I know for those of you who've been following the AMG-CoP and were able to join us in November in Abuja and April in Nairobi, this issue of productive use seems to have been coming up sort of time and time again as something of keen interest. So the goal for today is really sort of to just introduce some of the major considerations when thinking about productive use in mini-grids. Quick snapshot of the agenda for the day. So we're joined by two experts from our AMG-CoP network. Sam Booth, who's actually a colleague of mine here at NREL, works quite deeply on mini-grid issues in sub-Saharan Africa, leads a large program of technical work funded by Power Africa. So we're quite fortunate to have him here. He's going to be talking through some of the sort of technical and business considerations of productive use to sort of set the scene and help us all think through this. Then we also are joined by Ieva Indriunaite, who I'm sure, Ieva, again, apologies, I probably butchered the last name, and you can tell us exactly the pronunciation. Ieva's from SD Strategies and the Let's GP Energy Working Group, and she's going to then share a little bit more about sort of the policy implications and sort of strategies for actually encouraging productive use in mini-grids. That'll be followed by a Q&A session, and hopefully we'll be able to have a bit of a group discussion and kind of some brainstorming together on strategies for how we can better encourage productive use. This is a fairly new and sort of emerging area, so there is not a lot of precedent to go on necessarily. So it's a really exciting place to be working, an exciting topic to be thinking about. I think a lot of opportunity for us as the mini-grid community of practice to make an impact and think about kind of how we want to work in this space moving forward. And then finally, we're going to close with a short preview of next month's AMG-CoP meeting in Berlin, and try and get your feedback on some of the agenda for that and topics and things of that nature. So anyway, I guess one thing before handing it over to Sam, we do hope this will be sort of an interactive session. I think you can all, I think there's a raise your hand function if you all have comments, questions you want to pose as Sam and Ieva go through their presentations, and then also hopefully we'll have some lively conversation at the end after we've heard from Sam and Ieva. So anyway, without any further ado, I guess I will go ahead and hand it over to Sam to kick us off.
So thank you all for joining, and nice to meet you all. Looking forward to talking about productive use, and then also giving a little more kind of background on NREL's work in this space. Okay, can everyone see my slides? It looks like they're up. So let me know if not, but my name's Sam Booth. I work at NREL. So I just wanted to start out with a little bit of background on NREL, and I'll give you guys a little bit of background on the work I do at NREL. But NREL is a U.S. Department of Energy laboratory located in Golden, Colorado. This is our campus on the screen here. We've been working in kind of the off-grid, microgrid space for about 30 years, starting with the Village program, Village Power program, and continuing now to our current work with Power Africa. In that context, I lead our work with Power Africa on microgrids, and I've also done a variety of other microgrid work across the world in Asia, and then also domestically for resilience, as well as in some of these laboratory facilities. So happy to talk also more about some of that other work if anyone's interested, maybe offline or at the end of this. And also, I'd much rather have this be a kind of open dialogue and discussion. So please do ask questions. Please let us know what we can do to kind of help your efforts to encourage and develop productive use. So this first slide is just sort of talking about definitions of productive use. So kind of narrowly defined, it's really talking about activities that generate income from the use of electricity. So people use electricity for value-added processing for small businesses. Sort of a little bit more broadly, sometimes it's contextualized as basically anything that improves the quality of life. So that might be more like healthcare, education, street lighting at night. I just want to say, I think those are both valid definitions, but I think for this presentation, for the context of this discussion, we're going to focus more on the narrow definition. So kind of commercial activities that help drive economic development and help create income. So the pictures on the right are just one of my favorite examples of kind of local economic development. So this is a small workshop in rural Indonesia, about 8 hours down a dirt road, where someone had bought some machine tools, some welding, and they were making these small hydro turbines. So what you see is the machine tool, some gears for the turbines, and then the finished product. But this is, great use of electricity, and someone that actually, got a small hydro system, installed it, and built this workshop to power his, basically use the hydro system to power his workshop and sell more turbines. So this is kind of, light industrial manufacturing, but I always thought it was a great example of local economic development, local job creation, local value creation, and keeping value in the community. And another thing that was really nice about this is when these turbines broke, which, things happen, they do break, everybody knew where to bring them. They could bring them right back to the workshop. They could fix them. It was a relatively easy kind of O&M process, which isn't always the case with some kind of maybe more imported technology. So that example would fall in the kind of light manufacturing example. We often see a lot of kind of carpentry, welding, tailoring, or sewing in that example, as well as probably ice making. We see a decent amount of kind of commercial activity for ice making, particularly in fishing communities. The ones out on Lake Victoria are one example. Another example we often see or sometimes see in fishing communities is lights. So solar lights that can be brought into a microgrid, charged up during the day, and then the fishermen can bring those out on their boats at night. The other two kind of, main examples that we see are more primary kind of agricultural based industries. So kind of your staple or cash crops, maize, coffee, chocolate, kind of depends on the country, the region, but basically understanding the value chain for those commodities and looking at ways to do value-added processing, whether that's drying, kind of grinding, various types of milling, but basically opportunities to either preserve or add value to those agricultural commodities. And then a variety of kind of retail or commercial enterprises, from phone charging, hair salons, kind of bars or restaurants, cafes, things that, you know, use maybe a small amount of electricity, but they have, you know, an appliance or two to help bring income into that business and help offer a service to the local community. So just that kind of a broad brush, those are kind of the three, you know, general categories that we see of productive use. And really the specifics and the specific opportunities vary by location in terms of, you know, what are the best opportunities in a given location. Really depends on, is this a fishing community? Is it a farming community? Are there, you know, what are the local economic development opportunities? So I just wanted to share a little bit of data from work we did on microgrids in Africa. So this is kind of the chart on the top left is the distribution of customers in a typical microgrid. So what you see is a variety of connections. Most of the connections, you know, you see a little bit above 400, maybe 500 or so home connections, then about kind of 200 business connections. And there's definitely, in our experience, not a, you know, discrete line between what's a home and what's a business. There's often a lot of kind of small businesses run out of homes, so some kind of home and business, and then public facilities. And the chart on the bottom right shows just kind of a distribution of the types of businesses that we saw in this analysis, looking at a variety of microgrids in Africa. So lots of small shops, restaurants, bars, phone charging, kind of some of the things I talked about, and probably not a huge surprise to this audience, but as someone that's trying to understand maybe what the load of a microgrid would be, this type of information is, or what, you know, typical productive uses will happen in a community, another good source of kind of trying to estimate what will come out of that. I wanted to talk a little bit about basically mini grids, and there's a really strong interest in mini grids and productive use right now. And I think a lot of that comes back to that mini grids can provide an amount of energy in terms of a quantity, a duration, a reliability for productive uses that a lot of smaller systems like solar lanterns, solar home systems can't. There are some kind of mid-scale applications where you could power, let's say, a standalone grain mill or a water pump or something like that with solar. I think, you know, in a dense community with relatively loads in relatively close proximity, the microgrid is probably a better solution to power a collective number of those devices, but certainly some of them can be powered by standalone solar systems. But many can't, and many of the large ones require, you know, specialized kind of power, let's say 3-phase power and maybe 10 kilowatts of power, you know, on average, with even higher inrush current. So some of the loads can be quite large, and the mini grid is particularly helpful for that. What's interesting about that, and I think what's exciting to me about mini grid development, is a lot of what it seems like people hope for with energy access projects is economic development. Our experience and a lot of the kind of research in this space has said if you just provide small amounts of power for consumptive uses like lighting and phone charging, those are certainly beneficial, they're certainly useful, they certainly improve people's lives, but they don't necessarily improve people's incomes. The income improvement and the economic development comes from the productive uses of energy. So as Tim mentioned, and Tim works on this program extensively too, NREL supports the Power Africa Beyond the Grid program. So I lead this program, and there's kind of 3 main things we're doing within the context of this program: providing a variety of technical assistance to microgrid developers. So this is things like analysis to determine maybe whether lead acid or lithium ion batteries are a better techno-economic solution for that developer, to look at system commissioning standards, customer agreements, kind of a variety of things that are largely predicated on helping deploy NREL's quality assurance framework, which was developed over the last kind of couple years, but really based on 20, 30 years of experience in this industry and noticing the need for more standardization, more kind of people to talk about these microgrid systems the same way, so that they start looking similarly, the risk are reduced. So I'll talk about the quality assurance framework a little bit more so, but I wanted to just introduce it here because a lot of our work in Africa is really focused on implementing the QF, including some of this work on productive use. So the two other things that we are doing as part of that project are working with governments to help develop the enabling environment for microgrids. So we were just in Uganda supporting the energy regulator in Uganda to develop new off-grid regulations. We're doing some similar work in Senegal, some other kind of similar work in Ghana, have supported some projects in Nigeria. And then from both of those things, both the technical assistance and the government work, we have published a variety of reports to help kind of push some of the information and some of our learnings out into the broader kind of audience and stakeholders for this sector. So the report on the top right, I know the pictures are kind of small, is our report on the productive use of energy written in cooperation with Energy for Impact. So a lot of what I'm going to go through here is in this report, and there's links to it kind of throughout this presentation, but if this is interesting to you, I encourage you to check it out. And if there's something we can do to support developers in your country or support kind of the policy and regulatory environment in your country, we have the ability to do that both through this Power Africa program and also through the AMG-CoP program. So Tim and I are happy to kind of talk with anybody that would like kind of more support in any of these areas and figure out maybe what the best avenue to provide that support might be. This slide really focuses on the mini grid model and the QAF. So the QAF was designed to take what's a relatively safe investment in a lot of markets in terms of utility investments or utility scale power systems are a pretty safe investment. It's because the utilities are well established, the regulatory environment is strong, they know their customers very well, and they know that their customers are going to pay. A lot of that kind of low risk, kind of standard utility business model breaks down in the off-grid sector. Part of that is the higher cost of power to provide power to remote customers, the kind of lack and poor understanding of cash flows and revenues, and also the relatively small amount of revenues, and just a poorly understood risk profile. So a lot of this kind of risk comes back to productive use in a lot of ways. Without that productive use, let's say the cash flows are a lot harder. If incomes are not going up, it can be hard for people to pay for this amount of power. If you can correlate electricity consumption to incomes, you get a much larger amount of load on the microgrid, and you also get a higher ability and willingness to pay, and that improves the risk profile. So I can talk more about that, but it's all kind of linked in, and productive use is really key to a lot of this. I won't spend too much time on the quality assurance framework. Just to introduce it briefly here, it's focused on basically that customers need to understand the power they're getting. They need to be able to pay for it, and there need to be sort of reasonable thresholds and standards for things like power quality, power availability, reliability. These all apply to productive use businesses in the sense of if you're starting a business and you're dependent on, let's say, a certain amount of electricity supplied at a certain quality, you need to be able to count on that and have that supply there reasonably reliably for your business to operate and make money. And then there also needs to be sort of an accountability framework behind that of what happens if these things are not met, how are system performance reported, what's the process for verifying that. So one of the pieces of work we did as part of Power Africa support was really looking at tariffs. And I'm not going to go too much into the tariffs and the types of tariffs. There's a great report out there that Tim wrote on this. There's a link to it at the end. But I will say, these are the load profiles from 11 different microgrids. The blue one that's kind of highlighted is the average of those load profiles. we saw a pretty big variation in the one with the kind of the big nighttime spike with a really heavy residential load versus the kind of larger one in the middle of the day and a much smaller residential load. So the one with the much larger load in the middle of the day is a much more commercial heavy, i.e. productive use heavy load profile. And the important thing about this in the context of tariffs is that it really reduces the overall cost for the microgrid. So having the solar that can more directly supply energy to the load both adds more load and reduces the cost of supplying that load. So all that to say the load profile matters a lot. And as you're looking at productive uses, it can be really beneficial to have productive uses that have either steady or large daytime loads. So this is some other work we were doing on cost reduction. And basically all the bar charts are various kinds of cost reduction. The last one that says I is that commercial heavy load. So in this kind of representative case, having that commercial heavy load lowered the cost of production about 20%. So it's not a trivial cost reduction for these systems, which are relatively costly compared to the main grid. And one of our goals in working in this space is drive down costs, both for the developers and the consumers. And one really good way to drive down costs is to have more productive use loads. So a little bit more about kind of the productive use loads. Really what the developers tend to care about are things like the characteristics of the load and the characteristics of the customers. So where is the load located? That's really more like where in my power system is it located? Is it right near my power plant? Well, that's great. That's easy to supply. It'll be cheap to connect versus, oh, is it a farm that's 3 kilometers from my existing power plant and maybe a kilometer from my existing distribution grid? So it's kind of 2 key considerations there are really what's it going to cost me to connect this load and how far is that load? Am I going to have power quality problems, let's say voltage drop, because the loads are pretty far away. Related to that is the magnitude of the load. So what's the peak load? What's the average load? What's the minimum load? Kind of what are the times of day of people using the load? Is it a single phase load or is it a 3-phase load? That can be a big consideration. A lot of the existing microgrids that have been built are single phase systems. If someone comes in and wants to build a, let's say a maize mill where it has a 3-phase motor, that requires a retrofit to be able to supply 3-phase power to that system. And then there's a consideration of, do I modify the whole distribution network, let's say to be 3-phase, or do I just supply power to a particular load or some amount of particular loads with 3-phase power? And if there's a load like that with a large motor, what kind of inrush currents are in that motor? Those currents can be kind of double the average current and non-trivial for a small power system. So the charts on the right show basically actual load profiles of productive use loads in a variety of African microgrids. So these are kind of average profiles, but it shows for someone that's kind of trying to understand these loads in terms of magnitudes, times of day, things like that. Kind of what that might look like and what they might want to estimate. And then also the other thing that developers tend to care a lot about is, what are the characteristics of the customer? Is this a new customer or existing customer? And really a lot of this comes down to repayment risk and risk in general. If I'm going to invest a large amount of money, let's say to connect this customer, maybe even add more generation to my system to supply this customer, I want to make sure I can recoup that investment. So how do I go about recouping that investment? Is basically I need to charge that customer some amount of money over some period of time in order to recoup it. I need to make sure they're going to be there for that amount of time. There is a tariff consideration here too. We've seen kind of a variety of approaches. Some developers do offer lower tariffs to productive use customers, i.e. larger loads, and some developers offer lower tariffs for consumption at certain times of day. So let's say daytime consumption. So there are ways to kind of encourage and incentivize productive use in microgrids with the use of tariffs as well. The next slide shows just kind of some examples. These are more of the kind of small commercial retail examples, but the types of appliances that someone might use and the various wattages of these appliances. And I'm sure you guys are familiar, but a lot of the, the microgrids that are going in for energy access are relatively small. Let's say maybe a couple kilowatts. So adding maybe even a 2.5 kilowatt hair dryer or a 4 kilowatt oven is not a trivial load in terms of the total amount of power and draw on the system. And that inrush current that I was talking about is that last column on the right. So if you look at the blow dryer, the hair dryer, this is a 3-phase load, and the inrush current is basically 3 to 4 times the average wattage, which is more of the first column. So certainly there's technical considerations to putting that kind of appliance onto your microgrid. Not that you don't want to do it, you just want to think about it, you want to understand it, because if you don't do that, what happens is if you have a really large inrush current, your inverter trips off and potentially your whole system goes down. And then all of your customers, including the productive use customer, are not happy with you, and you have to go reset that. That can cause lost revenue, time to go out and do that if you don't have a local operator that can do that. So certainly lots of design considerations around there. There are also considerations for the entrepreneur. So basically, in a lot of village, what we see is there's kind of 2 kinds of entrepreneurs. There's folks that have existing businesses and they're looking at either electrifying some component of an existing business that may be manual now or maybe powered by a diesel generator, or it's someone looking at starting a new business. And for all of these, you basically need to do kind of business analysis. You need to know how much revenue do I estimate from getting from whatever the product is that I'm selling, what's the cost of the equipment, how much energy does that use. So that goes into cost. It's essentially capital costs and operating costs, and what's the financial return, and then also what kind of power am I getting out of mini grids, and does it meet my needs for power quality, power availability, things like that. So the chart on the right, and this is from the report and some work that Energy for Impact has done, is showing basically a representative business case for an egg incubator. So it's about $100, $122 capital investment. It's about 100 watts of power, consuming about 2.4 kilowatt hours of power a day. Won't read all this, but basically has a cost of power about $45 a month, expenses including that of $83 a month, and a profit about $42 a month. So this is a relatively good appliance for developers in that it's a pretty flat load, relatively small load, but so easy to manage. It's also a good opportunity for entrepreneurs, pretty good payback here. But it's also, let's say, an appliance that operates, when it's on most of the time. So you need pretty good power quality and pretty good power availability to make sure the incubator is doing what it needs to do to warm the eggs. So the next slide just shows an example of basically a larger productive use load. This is a water treatment load. So basically the system on the top left is a water purification system that could be connected to a microgrid. It's a much more capital intensive system. It's not really a huge power demand, so it's only really 400 watts of power, but all the water treatment equipment is relatively expensive. But this is baselined, this analysis is based on water usage in rural Uganda in cooperation with Healing Waters and Jibu to kind of look at some data, some water they're supplying and selling in rural Uganda. So it's baselined on real data, and it shows that while even though this is a relatively large investment, there's a pretty good payback here and a pretty good business opportunity. And this maybe is a good segue into kind of talking a little bit about our next slide. Actually, I'm going to stay here for 1 minute. Is like this is a relatively large investment and something that would probably require microfinance or on-bill financing or some type of financing to help facilitate this type of investment in a rural environment. So while the payback might be good and it might be an attractive opportunity. Probably without some co-support, this isn't the type of investment we would typically see necessarily. I wanted to share a little bit more from analysis from the report. So this is a case looking at a maize mill in Tanzania at various loadings. So the chart on the left shows basically the base case, which is a 100 household village in Tanzania with no mill. And then the yellow, gray, and green bars show that grain mill at various loadings. So this is kind of average use over an 8-hour workday during the work week. So it's a lot of these milling shops in our experience. There's an operator there and they operate kind of when someone brings them a product. So someone brings them a product, they mill it, they give it back. So it's not a continual operation, and it's much more typically a fee for service than someone that's milling their own grain or purchasing their own grain. So that what that impacts is basically how much the mill is used. And what we wanted to show here is, in the yellow case and the gray case, it's actually a good for the microgrid. So including this mill lowers the levelized cost of energy, increases the demand. And the green case, where it's operated only seasonally, so from November to April, it actually increases the cost for the microgrid and for all of the customers unless this mill was charged more. And that's because the system needs to be overbuilt. It needs more PV, bigger inverters, more batteries to supply this mill. But if the mill is only operating seasonally, a lot of that capacity is wasted in the off season when that mill is not operating. And the chart on the right just shows the capital expenditure required for each of these systems, showing that, the base case system, let's say $80,000, the total CapEx goes up quite a bit in all of these scenarios to add that extra equipment to supply just this mill. So it's not necessarily a trivial investment on the part of the microgrid operator in terms of the excess capital required to supply this mill. So not only do they need to make sure it's going to operate, enough that they can recoup that investment, and that's really operating enough hours during the year and enough years forward in time. So it's a tricky analysis, but what it's meant to show is a lot of times I think people think any productive use load on a microgrid is good, and our experience is lots of them are good, but they're not always good. So it takes a little bit of consideration to make sure from a developer's perspective that it's worthwhile to serve that load, and that load isn't better served by a standalone diesel generator or something like that. And the last slide I think I have on here is talking a little bit about what our experience has been of people kind of strategies to help encourage productive use. So what we've seen is a lot of training and capacity building, either from the microgrid developers themselves or from NGOs, and that really comes in the form of working with local entrepreneurs to help them understand what business opportunities exist, help them improve their existing business opportunities, maybe bringing appliances to the village level and showing people kind of, this is what the appliance looks like, this is how it works, kind of, it's also always helpful to see it, touch it, kind of experience it. So that kind of training and capacity building can take a few different forms, but it's really trying to work with those entrepreneurs to understand their business opportunities and grow those business opportunities. One way to really help do that has, I think, had some success is equipment financing, and that can be either done by the developer or a third party, but it's overcoming that initial investment cost with some form of a pay-as-you-go model. So typically there's still a small down payment, but then a pay-you-go model for the bulk of the balance, essentially. One thing that I think is a good opportunity that we don't see as much is kind of coordination with other development programs for agricultural intensification, for water treatment, for other things. And there seems to be, in our experience, a lot of co-benefit opportunity, but not always a lot of integration between the programs. We have seen a lot of requirements as part of particular tenders. I think this is part of the tender that's out in Nigeria of basically whoever is developing the microgrid they must find a kind of local productive use to partner with and include in their system. So that's one way to get it, is to kind of mandate it through some type of a process, but that only works if you have a tender and you kind of have that level of control. And I do think there's a variety of policy and regulatory mechanisms that could support this. Most of these haven't been tried, so I'd really like to kind of have a maybe discussion at the end or at the end of both presentations about kind of the feedback from the community on basically policy and regulatory options and what people think about what are the options and what are the trade-offs to the options. But you know, at a high level, I think the options are things like incentives for productive use. So if you're giving, let's say, a private operator a concession to, you know, operate a microgrid, can you tie some of that concession to a certain amount of productive use or a certain amount of, you know, load growth over time? You can also do things in system design standards like maybe requiring three-phase systems or certain levels of power availability and power quality so that productive uses can come in. And maybe in places where tariffs are regulated, you want to allow certain kinds of training and capacity building, equipment financing perhaps as part of that tariff calculation so that the developers can provide those services, but also recoup some of those costs. So lastly, this is our kind of list of resources. Most of the figures and things you've seen have come from one of these reports, and there's a few more coming soon. And then I'll just say, Tim and I are happy to discuss with you ways to support your programs and provide assistance to them if that's of interest.
All right. Thanks so much, Sam. Appreciate that. I think it's a great sort of primer and an introduction to a lot of the sort of technical and business considerations and some of the different use cases for productive use. And I think the sort of bit on strategies at the end is a great segue into the next presentation, which is Ieva, who's gonna share a little bit more on sort of the policy implications and sort of strategies for encouraging this with us.
So hello everyone again. I'll just share my presentation. My name is Ieva Indriunaite. My surname is a little bit difficult to pronounce. I think Tim did quite well. As Tim mentioned, I work with SD Strategies and I support their work within the Let's GP.
Well, I think we might have lost her.
I was just saying that most of you are probably already familiar with the work that we're doing. So I think I'll just probably skip these two slides. This is just to stress that SD Strategies is currently chairing the Energy Working Group of the Let's GP. And within this remit, we are supporting 2 communities of practice, and that includes the AMG-CoP. Here's some of the concepts that I wanted to mention. So the outline of my presentation, I kind of thought that I would start a little bit by just reiterating the importance of why we should maybe even talk about support specifically targeted at productive use beyond the broader support for mini-grids. Then talk about the trends, which is developers getting engaged in this field. And finally, get back to the idea of what is the remaining role, or what is the added role of the policymakers that they should play in this field, and really to open up for a discussion with all of you in terms of what your experiences show and what you think about these things. So yes, first of all, I'll run through the first part quite briefly. In terms of the gap and why do we talk about the need to support PUE? So as Sam has already covered, you know, he he discussed a lot of the technical elements and why it is important to, why the PUE load is important for developers, as well as, of course, linking it to the economic development, and so the importance for local entrepreneurs. But what I wanted to reiterate that is that productive use, as most of the studies overwhelmingly show, does not happen automatically, despite the interests of both of these groups, and including the governments if we talk about the long-term local economic development. So here is just an example of two recent academic studies, which, as I said, is really only two examples in the broader field of research of impact evaluations of energy projects, off-grid energy projects, whether specifically focusing on mini-grids or more broadly on other options of rural electrification. The overwhelming conclusion is that this link between getting electricity access and really achieving a growth in productive use of electricity in commercial activities in the beneficiary communities is not overwhelmingly automatic, and that additional support is needed. And what Sam has already also mentioned, and this is again reiterated throughout the practitioners' discussions in academic literature and wherever you really look at, are these what I would call the key pillars of PUE support. So here it is, they have already been mentioned, but you could probably group them into kind of two categories, and the first ones are the three on the left. So we talk about the knowledge development and capacity building, which could be called business development services. To make use of the electricity that they have to either establish new businesses or grow their existing businesses. And so these are the three key pillars on the left. And the business development services, or the one on the far left, you know, it can be, as Sam has mentioned, it could start with the simple things of just introducing the use of electric appliances, getting ideas of how this could improve the commercial opportunities, to really looking into the management of growing enterprises and really a much more kind of broader approach. The middle one is access to finance. And here you would talk not only about access to finance to be able to buy appliances, electric appliances, but also the affordability dimensions as well. So one of the studies that was mentioned on the previous slide, for example, concluded that within this access to finance dimension, the important part is also the ability to afford a certain level of consumption of electricity to be able to fully make use of it as required for the business to grow. And lastly, but not least, is the value chain strengthening and access to market support. And here again, we're talking about, you know, once the businesses, hopefully the local entrepreneurs' activities start to grow, how do we ensure that they will have the markets to offer their services or products to? And again, this could be sort of as broad or as narrow as you want to define it. And finally, it's the design of appropriate technical solutions. And here, so this is basically mostly what Sam has already discussed. And maybe I would just reiterate that, you know, from where we are today, this last pillar is really a combination of the interests of both developers, mini-grid developers, and the local entrepreneurs. And it's the really finding the balance between their needs that is so important. So in the next part, I wanted to discuss what I would see as a sort of more recent trend in terms of who is supporting the productive use. So we identified the need for supporting productive use, but who is doing it and how? And the trend that I'm talking about that has been growing in recent years is that private sector developers operating across sub-Saharan Africa are increasingly getting their hands dirty, so to say. They're getting engaged in providing these services along those key pillars to the local entrepreneurs because of this importance of product. Breaking down a little. I hope you can still hear me. So the
Yeah,
survey.
we lost about the last 30 seconds or so. If you could just back up about 30 seconds, maybe.
Okay,
Thanks.
I'm
Sorry.
really sorry about that. So I was just saying that the next 1 or 2 slides will be based on the survey that I have recently conducted. The idea was to really reach out to some of the private developers operating across the region. So here you can see a map. It's a mix, and that's why the respondents' profiles were also a broad mix from larger companies to smaller companies, both kind of more locally established as well as more international ones. However, the majority were, you would say, probably on the smaller side. They were operating 1 to 3 mini-grids. So Sam outlined, this from the very kind of technical side of things, but here we wanted to learn really the current perspectives of the private developers and how they think about this. So the kind of the 3 overarching conclusions or findings that we had was that there is a very strong importance assigned to productive use. All of the developers basically said that they do consider productive use, which is very much in line with what Sam has outlined. Importantly, they noted that they do that during the initial project planning. I think, except for one, all of the respondents indicated that. And this is an important point to remember for later in my presentation. And also, which is exactly the trend that I wanted to highlight, is that most of them indicated that they themselves now provide support to foster productive use, uptake, and development. So out of the 24 respondents, 22 said that they do have some kind of an approach within their businesses, business models to support productive use. In terms of how the developers do that, I have suggested that we could look at it from the perspective of a more traditional versus a more innovative approaches. So for example, developers sometimes either provide, as I think Sam has mentioned, either provide loans themselves, or they try to bring in partnerships with microfinance institutions. Yes.
Ieva, sorry, you dropped out sort of right at the beginning of this slide, and it seems like it's pretty important. So could you just start at the top of the slide again? Sorry.
Okay. Sorry about that. So again, as I said, I was just suggesting that when we look at how the mini-grid developers support productive use uptake, we could talk about sort of what you could call a more traditional model, which would see them providing support directly to local entrepreneurs along the key pillars that were highlighted previously. So it could be capacity development, access to finance. Some of them are starting the market approach. However, I'll come back to that point. However, we can see a number of more innovative approaches being used. Again, this is not an official kind of classification, but this is just a way of looking at it. So the fee-for-service approach is where we see that developers, in addition to providing electricity, they invest in setting up electricity-based service centers or workshops where they sell the use of appliances, and in this way, they are enabling the local developers to overcome the challenge of not perhaps having sufficient finance to invest in upgrading their equipment, or they're supporting the final products. There is another model that is called the more productive use zone model. facilitate, so from the developer's perspective, this approach can facilitate savings on the distribution costs. So where you have all the kind of key entrepreneurs, all the productive users in the community kind of circled around into one area. From the perspective of entrepreneurs, again, they can share some of the costs by using the equipment jointly. So this is also a benefit for them. And finally, it's what is sometimes referred to as the keymaker model, the name used by a company called Inensis, and it's the developer-owned and operated productive use business. So here we see developers, this is slightly different to the other approaches. We see developers establishing what could be seen as traditional anchor kind of load. However, they operate and own them themselves, and so they themselves become their own key consumer of the mini-grid supplied electricity. And if you look at the findings of the survey, we really see a range of different approaches being used. So the more traditional one is the one in dark blue. On the right-hand side, you can see that nearly 40% have indicated that they still focus largely on really supporting the developers along the key pillars. Of access to finance, and which is quite important to note, none of the respondents noted that they are providing any specific support related to access to markets. However, we can see that a number of them are venturing into those what we have called innovative approaches. And finally, which is also, I think, quite interesting to see, is that quite a few of them are using a mix of approaches. So they might be establishing their own kind of developer-run anchor client, and they're still providing additional support to local entrepreneurs, or they're sort of mixing and matching, sometimes following an initial assessment of what would work in a community, or following the resources available to them. But they're really support given based on their abilities and based on the needs in the community. As was noted by one of the respondents, and I quote, "It is important to try everything to foster productive uses." So there's really a very keen approach to this. And so finally, where does this leave the policymakers? I think it's very important for policymakers to acknowledge that mini-grid developers are increasingly playing a role in this field. However, it's also interesting to take a step back and see where the mandates overlap and where there might be additional needs for public policies to come in. So what we have seen, the public policy focus specifically on productive use has been rather limited. So here we have seen the private developers come in. The benefits, of course, are that we have seen a number of innovative approaches. So they're really trying new models and seeing what could work. Their strategies are, of course, very targeted to the local needs of the specific communities that they work in. However, if we think about it, and based on the survey as well, we can see that there are different capacities of private developers to engage in these activities. We have seen that, for example, in the more traditional approaches, a number of respondents, even those that suggested their interest in supporting the entrepreneur, their comfort zone and their abilities and sometimes capacities to support this, despite their strong interest. Another perhaps dimension to think about is that while being really tailored to local needs, the approaches used by developers are largely on a project-by-project basis. And if we really, from a sort of public policy considerations and long-term local economic development considerations, I think there's a strong argument to look beyond the project environment and to really think how the productive use support could tie in with the broader local development priorities and regional development priorities. So there is arguably, and this is the argument that I wanted to put forward, that there electrification and the rural development can
Ieva,
really...
sorry, you dropped out again. You said this is the argument I want to put forward, and then we lost you. And I feel like that was probably pretty important.
So the key argument is that the integrated planning, which we haven't perhaps seen so far to a great extent, is still very relevant today to really try to see how by interlinking the rural development and rural electrification agendas, how we can build on these synergies and think a bit more kind of broader scale, think a bit more long-term about the needs beyond the immediate project environment. So just to and this is a graph of how I have classified the suggested approaches that were there, I would say about 5 to 10 years ago. And so you can see this, you can see that there are sort of 5 approaches noted here, and I used 2 dimensions. So on the vertical dimension, you can see the link moving from a more passive approach, and that's the passive approach of the governments, to a more active and direct engagement in supporting productive use. And on the horizontal axis, you can see a move from a more demand-led approach to a more strategic thinking of how the development and electrification agendas can be interlinked, how to think long-term, how to establish far left is where the governments could provide support to ad hoc needs of local entrepreneurs by providing support directly to already existing actors that are operating in the fields, like the NGOs, for example, who may have been already training the communities in this area, but not have sufficient resources to do it. And so this is one of the easier approaches, perhaps a more passive approach to support them, to support local entrepreneurs indirectly. The more direct but still ad hoc approach would be to provide direct support to entrepreneurs, but still following the installation of the mini-grid. And then the 3 approaches that are kind of more towards the right and upward, they're looking at a slightly more strategic way of the productive use dimension should be incorporated in existing programs in other sectors, so rural development or private sector development, agricultural development, and similar fields. And the top ones are really where governments could focus on specifically establish a specific program that targets the needs of productive users of electricity, and either focuses on existing businesses or covers the new value chains as well. And so if we look, finally, if we look at some of the survey results, I think it seems that the 2 approaches on the left may no longer be really the best way forward. The middle one, which looked at incorporating productive use into existing programs, could be considered. However, again, in the survey, for example, we asked developers to indicate whether they are aware of existing programs that would be sort of conducive to productive use, and most of them have responded that even where broader rural development programs exist, they largely do not take productive use into account. So even though this is an opportunity, it seems that so far that has not been put into place. And so that really kind of brings us to the top right corner, where we think about perhaps a more active approach from governments to think about productive use in their strategies, where increasingly they try to support mini-grid development and put the enabling framework for mini-grids into place. Really, what could be the targeted measures that would support the productive use uptake and development while keeping in mind the key priorities for broader rural development. And these are some of the resources that I have used here that you could look into as well, especially the second and the first three, actually, for some of you who might be interested to look at what has been said about these suggested policy approaches. Yeah, that's the end. So I think what I wanted to really raise is that my presentation has mostly been focused on bringing in a bit more on the understanding of what the private sector is, how the private sector views this issue at the moment, and also trying to highlight that perhaps, at least it looks like, there hasn't been so much of a targeted view from the governments of looking at productive use. And here I wanted to really, well, bring a bit of a challenge and ask for what you think and what is in place in your countries, and whether you think this would work, and whether it's still relevant, and how you see this issue.
Okay. Well, thank you, Ieva. Appreciate that. I think that was really helpful. You were cutting in and out quite a bit. I think we caught the vast majority of things. I would like to maybe ask you just to recap a few key points, if you can, that I think we missed pieces, if you don't mind. But before that, I just want to remind everyone that we're going to be answering some questions here real quick. So if you do have questions, please go ahead and type them into the chat box in the bottom right, and we'll make sure to get them answered. And then hopefully we can get everybody unmuted and have a bit of a discussion. But while everybody sort of thinks about their questions and kind of how this might apply in their countries and their context, Ieva, real quick, you mentioned you had the slide where you're talking about the 3 different models: fee-for-service, productive use zones, and the key maker model. I was wondering if you could quickly maybe just give us a bit of a 1-minute recap on that. We heard most of the fee-for-service and the key maker, but the productive use zones piece, I think we missed most of that. You had dropped out. So maybe you could give us just a brief recap on those 3 models.
Okay, sure. So yeah, the fee-for-service approach, I think that has been mentioned already by Sam as well. It's really where we talk about developers going beyond providing electricity sales to investing in setting up an electricity-based service center or workshop where they sell the use of appliances. So this would allow the local entrepreneurs to overcome the barrier of perhaps not having access to this is probably what I would highlight. The productive use zone so far, I think, is maybe one of the more new approaches, although it's quite straightforward. The idea is really that you try in the way that you geographically space out and design your distribution network, you create a hub, so to say, for small commercial electricity users to be located closer to the generating units and closer to each other, essentially. And so from developers' perspective, as I have mentioned, this could facilitate perhaps savings on distribution costs. In some cases, there's an argument that they might be able to provide a higher level of electricity, of power, and higher quality. That it could even be seen as a supportive measure for the access to markets, in a way, not quite sort of very broadly, but in a smaller sense, where because you still create a hub of economic activity, you could expect more clients to come through the area, and this is also something that could be of interest. However, I think what I would say is that there are kind of interesting dimensions in this model, but it's a bit uncertain as to to what degree they will manifest. But it's still definitely interesting to think about. Maybe I would mention that from the respondents who noted that they use this model, 2 of them were developers who use a specific technology where they integrate their production to buy the equipment together and use it together. And the last one was the so-called keymaker model, or the anchor load model. And here the main idea is that the developer establishes a business next to the mini grid, a commercial activity of a larger scale that could become the main so-called off-taker of the mini grid supplied electricity. And here the interesting point from a developer's perspective is that they certainly have more oversight of the load dynamics that Sam has extensively covered. And this is particularly interesting for them from that perspective, and also from the profitability perspective. In fact, what has been showed by the project run by Inensis and Jumeme was, for example, that the business that they established next to a mini grid was in fact bringing in kind of fast revenues, and perhaps even higher revenues than the electricity sales. Do you think that covers that answers the question?
Yeah, thank you very much for that recap, and for everyone, we're also going to make the slides available after the presentation, so you can go through and hopefully get in touch directly with Ieva and Sam and us as well, and we can continue this discussion. So we have had a few questions that I can pose to Sam and Ieva here. So the first was from Usman for Sam's presentation on the challenges. I guess, Sam, you mentioned sort of three challenges, and Usman was curious to know if those were sort of the only 3 challenges you see, or the biggest 3 challenges, if there are others as well in your perspective. I don't know if you want to try and shed some light on that.
I think I mentioned more than 3, but I think there are sort of a variety of challenges, and I would bucket them kind of into developer challenges with kind of assessing the loads and the opportunity, and making sure that the proposed productive use is a good fit for the developer. Kind of entrepreneurial challenges of making sure that the business makes sense and will be profitable for local economic development. And then the third bucket, which I think is often maybe a lot of what we were talking about, that Ieva was talking about, is like, even if those 2 both look good, how do you get the inertia and the momentum to actually make things happen? So and I think that seems to be the biggest challenge often, and this idea of you build the microgrid and that the productive use will come doesn't, as the literature showed, doesn't really seem to happen. So to me, that's kind of the biggest maybe open-ended challenge of how does one encourage or catalyze productive use with some of the things that we were talking about of training or incentives or financing. So Usman, I don't know if that answers your question exactly. Maybe tell me, or if you're able to kind of articulate your question a little bit more. I'd like to know if that answers it, or if you'd like to know or talk about something else.
Yeah, you have answered my question, but I'm thinking of issues of vandalization, thefts, and all sort of issues in the rural areas of northern Nigeria, in particular, that could be a challenge for the entrepreneurs and policymakers as well.
Yeah, I think, tariffs are particularly a challenge, in this off-grid space in general, and the productive use piece. I have seen it complicate that a little bit. It's complicated it more so, and I don't think Nigeria is the case for this, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think at least for the small mini grids in Nigeria, they're allowed to charge cost-reflective tariffs, and they're allowed to somewhat vary their tariff by kind of load or customer type or time of day. But there are some examples in some countries that I've seen where basically as part of the kind of national utility requirements, developers are required to charge sort of a set tariff, and they're not given the flexibility to vary that tariff maybe the way they would like, let's say, to charge a productive use customer who uses large amounts of energy during the day a different rate that's maybe more reflective of the actual cost to serve that customer. So there can be a challenge there. And then there are also sort of more general challenges with tariffs we've seen of kind of, and we looked at some of this in our productive use report, of some of the small operators that have diesel generators now might be operating their diesel generator at, let's say, 40 cents a kilowatt hour, where most of our experience with the off-grid microgrids is, tariffs are more in the 50 cent to $1 range. So they look, more, and they are, more expensive, at least on a cost per kilowatt hour basis. Sometimes the entrepreneurs get some benefit out of connecting to the grid. As an example, often they have to go pretty far to get fuel for their generators and their businesses, and that's kind of lost time and revenue. And also, if they run out of fuel, they may not be able to supply a customer. So there are some kind of other benefits, but they're a little bit harder to quantify. But certainly there's a number of considerations around tariffs that we've run into.
Thank you so much for the clarification.
Sure. Yeah, no problem.
Great, and I think sort of building on that, we had another question from Paul from the Nigeria Energy Commission about the question of really shedding a little bit more light on the policy approach. And Sam, I think you touched on some of that in your answer here, and then Ieva in your presentation quite a bit. I think this is sort of the big question mark when it comes to productive use. I think as Ieva's presentation illustrated, there is a lot of sort of uncharted territory with how do we encourage and sort of stimulate productive use. And that's one of the things that we're hoping that all of you as policy and decision makers in this space can help us think through and brainstorm what might be reasonable approaches in your countries, given your specific policy frameworks that exist where you all are working. But on the question of just kind of maybe shedding a little more light on the general policy approach, Ieva, you also were dropping out a little bit when you were going through the graph of the traditional policy approaches with the 5 bubbles. So maybe you want to field that one just at a high level, kind of the policy approach for PUE, particularly in countries where there's nothing to start with.
Yeah, so I won't go back through everything again, but I think what I would say so far, and maybe I should kind of, maybe I should just give a bit of a disclaimer at the start. So what I really have done recently is this really looking at the perspectives of the private sector. And I think naturally, have been put into place. However, from what I have seen so far, any targeted approaches to support productive use have been particularly limited. And so the bubbles that I presented, they are, and so both, that's applicable, what I'm saying is applicable both to what's happening in practice, as well as, you know, what is sort of developed on the more strategic level in terms of what's available for as resources for policymakers to look at. The bubbles come from, as I said, sort of initial reports when some experts started thinking about it about 10 years ago. And the initial approaches, the first one that I sort of have come across was Senegal. I believe that they tried to implement the idea of more integrated planning for really looking at how the rural electrification and the productive use related to bringing electricity to rural communities, how that can be linked to the work that is ongoing in the rural development sector, and really having a very strategic outlook of trying to integrate these two sectors. What I'm afraid I cannot say is how successful that has been. I think Senegal has generally faced some challenges in rolling out their mini-grid program. And I won't go into much detail on that front, but I think from what I have seen, there has not been done, not a good reflection
Okay,
of what
well,
is
I think,
definitely out there.
sorry,
Am
go
I still
ahead.
I'm still breaking out. I'm still breaking down.
Go ahead. Yeah, you're back.
Okay, sorry. But basically, yes, I think the reality is that based on what was indicated, let's say several years ago, it doesn't look like a lot of it has been put into practice. But I wanted to highlight that I think there is still relevance for thinking about these approaches. And I think that developers would see a particular, would see very positively a higher engagement from governments, and in their attempt to you know, even link the development and the electrification agendas. Perhaps on the tariffs as well, we did have a question on differentiated tariffs in the survey to developers. And of course, as Sam has mentioned, there are difficult, the first question comes but what I wanted to highlight is that many of them would like to see differentiated tariffs that would support productive uses. And that could be done in several different approaches. Primarily, some of them see, a larger number of them from the respondents would support having lower tariffs to actually encourage productive use uptake. Some of them specifically mentioned tailoring the tariffs to manage the load throughout the day, as you know, goes in line with Sam's discussion. And several of them highlighted that maybe they could use a higher tariff for commercial users to either just cover some of their costs because they consider that commercial users have a higher ability to pay.
Okay, well, I think we lost her again, but hopefully we caught most of that. I think that's pretty helpful. So we only have a couple minutes left here, and we want to make sure we get a chance to kind of give you guys a bit of a preview of the June meeting. But before we did, I wanted to give everybody else an opportunity to let us know if you have any thoughts or comments. I think we'd love to hear from all of you, your thoughts on sort of strategies for encouraging productive use, policy approaches, if you're aware of things that are being tried maybe in your countries or partner countries. So I don't know if anybody has any sort of last comments to contribute or add, but please go ahead and raise your hand, or if you're able to unmute yourself, I don't know, but we'd like to hear from you all. And Kamisa, are folks able to unmute themselves, or will we have to unmute them manually if they want to chime in?
We have to unmute them manually, but I would suggest that they write their questions down, especially because one of our presenters has Wi-Fi issues, so she may be able to respond to them properly, and we'll send the responses to them via email, along with the presentations and all of the other post-communication email that we'll be sending through.
Okay, great. All right, well then, yeah, if you all have questions, comments, thoughts, please do write them in the chat box. And then I think most importantly, we can pick up this conversation and continue this conversation through the community of practice, online via email, via the WhatsApp group, which I believe you all are on. If any of you are not on the WhatsApp group, please email myself or Jesse or Kamisa, and we'll make sure you get added to the WhatsApp group. And then, of course, finally, we can continue this conversation at the next mini-grid community of practice meeting, which will be taking place in June. So we wanted to give you guys a bit of a preview of what to expect. So are you all able to see my screen right now? I'm showing the sort of the draft agenda that we're working on for the June meeting. Well, hopefully you can see it. But this is going to be a two-day meeting on the side of the Global NDC conference taking place in Berlin. The Global NDC conference is June 12th, 13th, and 14th in Berlin, and we know many of you will be attending. Unfortunately, not everybody is attending the Global NDC conference, but those of you who are planning to go to the Global NDC conference, our fifth meeting will be on the side of that on June 10th and 11th. That's Monday and Tuesday. Sort of the tentative theme for the meeting is innovative business models for mini grids. Seems like sort of these concept of business models can really help address a lot of the questions and themes that have been coming out of previous mini grid community practice meetings, including some of this productive use questions, as we saw. Those are sort of productive use is a key element in making viable business models for mini grid, as well as some questions around tariffs and subsidies, and all of these issues that we've been discussing in our previous 4 meetings, all sort of, I think, come together around this issue of business models. So similar to the Abuja meeting in Nigeria, we're planning to have 2 days back to back. The first day will be a closed meeting just for all of us, for the AMG-CoP members. And then the second day, we're planning to open up to the public, to donors, to private sector players, to basically everybody else who would like to join. I'll briefly run through the agenda here. So we're planning to start with some member updates, just to kind of hear what everybody has been doing. We won't be asking you for slides like we have in past meetings. We'd like this to maybe be more of sort of a breakout session, roundtable, where folks can just kind of hear about what's happening from their peers. And then you'll see here we've created space for a member-led session and also a second member-led session potentially. So we'd like to try something a little different for this meeting. In the past, we've sort of as the AMG-CoP Secretariat have put together sessions, for all of you. At this meeting, we're really keen to hear from you, from our members, and so we're kind of asking for ideas, proposals, pitches. If any of you would like to maybe lead a session, a particular session on productive use, tariffs, or business models, any other issues that you find interesting and that you think other members of the community of practice might also find interesting and learn from. We'd love to hear those ideas and see if there's a way that we can kind of open it up so that some of you guys as our members can all lead sessions. We're also hoping to go back to Wakanda. So those of you who were in Abuja back in November may or may not remember the Wakanda case study and exercise we did. So we're hoping to do another bit of an interactive exercise based on Wakanda, and then also get some ideas for some next steps. On the second day, we're looking at having a bit of a finance-focused session, bringing in some of the donors. I think we got a lot of strong feedback from November that having the donors in the room, we had World Bank, USA, the African Development Bank, and others there speaking about their programs. So hopefully we can bring some of them back to further that dialogue with the donors and folks who might be financing some of these questions. Financing some of these projects. And then we'll also do a bit of a dive into the bilateral exchanges. So last time we heard about the exchange between Ghana and Nigeria. We just had an exchange with Ethiopia and Nigeria, so we'll hear a little bit about that. And then we'd really like to break out and try and get folks talking to one another to understand what are some other potential bilateral or maybe even trilateral exchanges that we could put together that you all would find interesting. And then finally, talking about specifically sort of innovative new ownership and business models for mini grids. So this is just a very high level. You can see there's a lot of blanks and a lot of question marks in here. So we're still in the process of developing this agenda for the 2-day meeting. The point of sharing it with you all now is we'd really like to get your feedback on, what would be of most interest to you, what sessions might excite you, what sessions do you think might not be necessary, kind of helping us drive the themes and the topics. So we'll shortly be sharing a draft of this with everybody, I think over email, but would be very keen to get your feedback. And then also secondly, on these member-led sessions are especially keen to get your ideas, your pitches, for if you might be interested in leading a particular session on a particular topic. We'd love to hear from you. Well, I guess in that case, yeah, thank you so much, Sam and Ieva, for joining us, and especially thank you to all of you for joining today's session. Hopefully you found it informative and helpful. Again, if you have questions, please throw them in the chat box, send them to any of us via email. Or on the WhatsApp group. We'll also make the slides available. And otherwise, we look forward to seeing you all again in the future at future AMG-CoP events and web sessions. So I guess we can go ahead and close down here. Thanks again to everyone.